After a layoff, there is always a quiet, unofficial audit that happens among the people who are left comparing who got cut against who got kept, looking for the logic underneath it. Most people assume that logic is a performance ranking, that the company sorted everyone from strongest to weakest and drew a line somewhere in the middle. The quieter mechanism is something else entirely. Layoffs are rarely built around who performed best. They're built around who would be safest, cheapest, and least disruptive to remove right now, and those two lists do not always overlap the way you'd expect. If you've ever watched someone clearly less capable than you survive a round of layoffs while you, or someone just as strong as you, didn't, you already know what this video is about. My name is Zara, and why certain employees always survive layoffs is what this video is about. Femi was the person his team could set a clock by. 18 months in, he had documented every workflow he touched, trained 2 junior hires without being asked, and built a shared file so thorough that nobody had to ask him a single question while he was out sick or on leave. The work simply continued. He shared a team with someone who operated almost the opposite way. Femi quietly absorbed her missed handoffs himself rather than escalate them, more times than he could count, because escalating had produced nothing the 2 times he'd tried. When the layoff list went out 8 months later, Femi's name was on it. Hers wasn't. The explanation he was given was almost kind. Your work is so well organized, the transition will be smooth. Nobody used the word replaceable. Nobody had to. Femi had spent 18 months making himself easy to remove, and the company had simply taken him up on it. The colleague, who had never documented a single process she ran, stayed exactly where she was, not because anyone thought she was better, but because nobody could say with confidence what would happen if she left. What happened to Femi isn't an anomaly, and it isn't a reflection of his work. It's the output of 5 mechanisms that decide who survives a layoff, and almost none of them are about who performed best. The first mechanism is the continuity risk filter. Leadership running a layoff isn't ranking performance. They're running a continuity risk assessment. The question isn't who delivers the most value, it's whose absence would create the most immediate operational pain. The system produces this because the priority during a layoff is avoiding new operational fires, not rewarding the strongest track record. A new fire right now is more costly and more visible than a quietly mediocre performer simply continuing as they were. The counter-move is to stop assuming your performance record alone is your protection and start paying attention to your own removal difficulty profile alongside your output, because that profile, not your last review, is what's actually being scored. You're in this one if you've watched someone less skilled than you survive a round you didn't. If your manager has said something like, "Things would fall apart without them," about someone who isn't your strongest performer. If you've never once heard leadership frame a layoff decision in terms of who's best, only in terms of who's essential to keep things running. Layoffs are not a performance ranking. They're a disruption avoidance plan wearing a performance ranking's clothes. The second mechanism is the documentation penalty. The more thoroughly you've documented your work, cross-trained others, and made your function transferable, the easier and cheaper it looks to remove you, because your departure redistributes cleanly. The undocumented, messy single point of failure gets protected, precisely because extracting them would create a visible problem nobody wants to manage in the middle of a restructuring. The system produces this through the same continuity risk logic, channeled specifically through how legible your knowledge is on paper. Legible knowledge means low extraction cost, and low extraction cost makes you a safe name to put on a list. A former colleague, Ines, ran finance reconciliation for 3 years and trained 2 backups out of genuine professionalism. When her department was cut by a third, those backups were the reason leadership felt comfortable removing her first. The very thoroughness that made her excellent at the job became the evidence used to argue she wasn't needed. The countermove is not to stop documenting your work that's the right professional practice, and it protects the organization regardless of what it does to you. The move is to make sure leadership also has visibility into the judgment and relationships behind the documentation, the parts that can't simply be handed to a successor in a folder. Don't let well-organized become the only word anyone uses to describe you. You're in this one if you've trained your own backup or successor without being asked. If you've heard the transition will be smooth used as a reason, not a reassurance. If everything you do could, on paper, be picked up by someone else tomorrow. The better you document yourself out of being necessary, the easier you make the decision to remove you. If you're already nodding at this one, hold on to it. The next mechanism explains exactly why the decision to cut you was never really about you at all. The third mechanism is the removal cost calculation. Nominating someone for a layoff is itself work building the justification, handling the transition plan, managing the paperwork that follows. Managers weigh that work against their own bandwidth, the same way they weigh everything else. The right name to cut sometimes loses to the easiest name to process, especially under time pressure. The system produces this because managers are evaluated on their own near-term workload and team stability, not on abstract organizational fairness. When forced to make cuts, they default to whichever option costs them, personally, the least effort to execute and defend. The counter-move is to make your value visible above your direct manager, not just to them. If part of the decision is genuinely about what's easiest for whoever is building the list, you want more than one person in a position to vouch for what it would actually cost to lose you. You're in this one if you suspect the people who survived weren't chosen by your manager alone. If your manager has described certain coworkers as hard to lose in ways that sounded more personal than strategic. If the criteria for the list were never shared with anyone, only the outcome. Your removal was never evaluated only on your value. It was evaluated on what it would cost someone else to remove you. The fourth mechanism is the compensation trap. When you quietly absorb the gaps, a weaker colleague leaves, covering missed handoffs, fixing errors before anyone notices. You make their output look stable on paper. In a layoff built on whatever metrics are visible at decision time, the underperformer you've been propping up can look perfectly safe to keep, while your own contribution, folded invisibly into the team's numbers, never shows up as something distinctly yours to protect. The system produces this because layoff decisions run on whatever data exists at decision time, and invisible compensatory labor, by definition, doesn't appear in that data. It only shows up as someone else's metric, quietly improved. The counter-move is to stop absorbing gaps silently, make the cost of someone else's underperformance visible and attributable, so that when the data gets pulled, your actual contribution is traceable to you specifically, not dissolved into a team average that has your fingerprints all over it and your name on none of it. You're in this one if you fixed a colleague's mistake quietly more than once this year. If your manager has praised the team's output in a way that erased your individual part in it. If you genuinely don't know how leadership would describe your specific contribution if asked directly, every gap you quietly closed for someone else stopped being evidence of anything you did. The fifth and last mechanism is the manager's self-preservation filter. The people who fight hardest to keep a given employee on the survival side of a layoff list are often protecting themselves, not the employee. Someone's departure might expose the manager's own gaps, undercut a program the manager built their reputation on, or simply mean more direct work landing back on the manager. Survival, seen this way, reflects what protects the manager's position as much as what protects the company. The system produces this because managers are participants in the layoff with their own stakes team size, program visibility, their own job security and advocacy decisions get filtered through that self-interest, whether or not anyone names it out loud. The counter-move is to understand that your manager's advocacy for you is not neutral. It's only as strong as it happens to serve their own position too. Build value that's visible and useful to more than one stakeholder, so your survival doesn't depend entirely on one person's self-interest lining up with yours. The hardest someone fights to keep you is usually the clearest sign of what they'd lose if you left, and it isn't always about you. Here's what happens when none of these 5 mechanisms ever get named. You keep optimizing for the wrong signal. You document more, compensate more quietly, perform more cleanly. All the things you were taught would protect you, and each one, left unexamined, makes you slightly easier to remove instead of slightly harder. Meanwhile, the organization never self-corrects because every round that protects the embedded over the excellent quietly confirms that embeddedness, not performance, is what survival actually tracks. The people who get cut repeatedly across multiple rounds, at multiple companies, tend to be the ones who keep believing each instance was a fluke, bad luck, a bad manager, a one-off restructuring, without ever updating the underlying strategy, because no one ever told them there was a strategy to update. None of this means you weren't good enough, or that you should have been messier, or less reliable, or less willing to help. If you've spent any time wondering what was wrong with your work, or your attitude, or your value, because you watched someone less capable survive something you didn't stop, what determined the outcome was not a measure of your worth. It was a continuity calculation, a documentation profile, a manager's own self-interest, running quietly underneath a process that looked, from the outside, like it was about performance. That's the part worth holding on to. This pattern is nameable, which means it's buildable around. The same embeddedness that protects someone less capable than you is a position you can occupy deliberately and for the right reasons, not by becoming messier or less excellent, but by making sure your value is visible, attributed, and known to more than one person in the room where these decisions actually get made. You were never the problem this system was solving for. You just hadn't yet been shown what it was actually solving for instead. I'm Zara. I'll see you in the next video.